I'm going to talk about a few edibles this morning. When I start to drone on about something I've already done in a previous episode, please feel free to tell me that we've seen that already and all that.
Alrighty.
These are my two important foraging principles. You really should insist on identifying anything you're going to eat. We had a friend of the family call me some months ago, and she said, I got this stuff coming up in my yard. I don't know what it is, but anyway, I ate it. And then she followed that with, and I've been throwing up for the last couple hours. Turned out what she had was she had a daffodil with no flowers, which she thought was an onion. And I would preface the whole presentation by saying, if you think something is an onion or a garlic or a leek, they're all in the genus Allium, and they all smell like their onion relatives. If you pick a plant you think is an onion and it doesn't have an onion-like odor, start over in your thought process. Now, the bad thing about eating a daffodil is daffodils have toxic alkaloids, and one of them is called lycorin. And the nice thing about lycorin is, even though it's toxic, it causes us mammals to throw up early and often. And therefore, you are protected from the worst of that mistake by the lycorin that pretty well empties the introductory eliminatory tract of a human being, or a dog, or a cat. But my main point is don't eat daffodils, and don't think something is an onion if it doesn't smell like an onion. Because they all, if correctly identified, have an onion-like odor. The most subtle of which is probably chives, but subtle is not in any way unevident. Anyway, what I have on the screen now, which I hope you can see, is Queen Anne's lace in flower. Queen Anne's lace is Daucus carota. It is literally the species of carrot that you buy in the grocery store. When you dig one up, the root does not look quite as large, of course, as our domesticated carrot, and they don't usually have any orange whatever. The orange in our domestic carrots originally came from a population of carrots tamed in Afghanistan in the 13th century. But the reason I want to mention Queen Anne's lace and wild carrot is they're fairly tricky to identify if you get into lots of them. And everybody thinks you can go out and forage wild plants, and if you mess it up, you might get sick, but that's about it. You can do yourself in with a carrot family mistake. The most toxic plants in North America are all in the carrot family. That, combined with the fact that they're a little tricky to identify, means if you think something's in the carrot family, my advice to you is don't go there until you have confidently identified a large number of the local flora and are confident that you are not going to leave a blank space at the breakfast table. Clearly, if you're going to eat anything, it should be correctly identified. And that goes 10 times over for if you're feeding it to your guests and loved ones. It's embarrassing to have everyone at the table pass away before dessert. And I would say that of all of the hemlock poisoning cases I've read, at least half of them thought they were eating Queen Anne's lace when they got into deep trouble or worse.
Peter, did you tell him about the area by the bridge in Okemos?
If you want to see a very prominent looking toxic carrot family member. In fact, it is called poison hemlock. It is the plant that was used to execute Socrates in the year 399 BC. If you are on Okemos Road and you are driving south and you cross the Red Cedar River near Wonk Park, when you get to the south end of that bridge, there's a weedy area right next to the road on the right side that has about a 6-foot tall wild hemlock growing there. Now, one thing about wild hemlock that helps you identify it is it looks like somebody came up to the plant with a popsicle stick and a bottle of magenta ink and spattered random splashes of random magenta ink all over the stems and petioles of the plant. And so if you want to look at a pretty nice one, there's one on Okemos Road right there at the south end of the Red Cedar Bridge. This is one of the most poisonous plants in the world. The last actual case that I read about was a woman in Washington State who picked a single leaf off the plant in her backyard, which she thought was Queen Anne's lace, and it was poison hemlock, Conium maculatum, and she could not be saved. Anyway, if you have a question at any point, please interrupt. Don't try to remember it till the end of the presentation because that always turns out badly. I am happy to have any questions. Okay, this is an illustration I did that shows the basic architecture of the structure of the flower of the carrot family, which we call an umbel. An umbel is a flower cluster where all of the individual peduncles, the stems of the flowers, originate from a single common point. And if you look at the drawings behind my text there, the drawing on the left shows a simple umbel. Now you might recognize this architecture. Queen Anne's lace is sort of the one next to it there on the right, but you also see this same architecture in onions and in milkweeds. The Queen Anne's lace drawing on the right shows what's called a double umbel, and that is that the first point of origin actually bears umbels, not single flowers. So that's why it's called a double umbel. And most of our carrot family members in our area have a double umbel structure. The old name for the carrot family was the umbelliferae, which means those bearing umbels. This is a very dangerous family to experiment with, so don't eat these until you're really confident that you're good at it. There is a picture of carrot Queen Anne's lace, and you'll notice that the umbel includes not only the stalks that produce the final umbels out near the end where the flowers are, but there are also some needle-looking structures that don't have flowers on the stem underneath the elements of the umbel. Those are called sterile bracts. They're called sterile because they don't include any flowers on them. And this is a feature you can look for to help you separate Queen Anne's lace from most, but not all, of the rest of this family. Now, the picture on the right, in this instance, you see the purple spattering. That is the Conium maculatum poison hemlock stems. The plant on the left is also a poison hemlock. And you can sort of see why a person not being careful could mistake such a thing for a harmless Queen Anne's lace. Now, this plant here is a very common plant in moist and wetland soil situations. This is called poison water hemlock. This is my nominee for the most toxic plant in North America. If you eat the tubers of this plant, you would be lucky to get a cell phone call off. The effects are quite fast and quite horrific. The fatal action on this plant is uncontrollable convulsions, which, as you can imagine, is not a recreational product. It does have one characteristic, however, that is quite nice in helping you identify it from most other plants in our area or in the world, for that matter. If you look at the close-up of the leaflets on the right, you'll see that the veins where they enter the actual edge or margin of the leaflet, they leave the leaf by emerging in a notch, not out at the tip of the tooth. If you look at the next toothed-edged plant that you see, almost always you see the supporting vein of that part of the leaf goes right out to the tip of the tooth. And as you can see here, these all end in the notch between the teeth, not out at the tip of the tooth. This is a nice characteristic that helps you identify water hemlock from everything else. Because other than that, it's not a terribly remarkable looking plant, except it has large flat leaflets that you see here, unlike the little tiny, finely developed needle-like leaves of wild carrot. Okay, this plant is one of our most common lawn weeds, grows in rich soil. It likes rich soil, but it needs moist and shady conditions, or at least partly shady conditions. This is called common chickweed, Stellaria media. It's one of our most common weeds, and in my world, one of the most delicious. We've had it as a very common weed in the botanical garden when I was there, and I would often weed the beds by eating them. The flavor is outstanding, in my opinion. These flowers that you can see in the picture here are roughly 1/8 of an inch in diameter. And if you look at them carefully, they look like they have 10 petals. But in actuality, it's just 5 petals slit to the base, more or less like rabbit ears. This is a characteristic of the carnation family that makes their flowers fairly distinct.
So, hey, Peter, just a quick question. Is the flavor of that weed a little bit on the sour side? Does that sound right? Or what does it taste like?
No, this is not sour.
Okay.
We don't have very many vocabulary words as human beings to describe tastes and smells. If we were dogs, we would have a much more rich and complex vocabulary in this way. So for me to say chickweed tastes like chicken is not very useful, and it doesn't. It doesn't taste like chicken either.
Is it lemony?
But it's not sour. It's not lemony. It's a mild flavored salad, but beyond that, I am not very much use in the description department.
Okay.
It often trails across the ground and forms patches. Here is a photograph of one such patch of common chickweed. You notice the leaves have opposite arrangement, that is, at each point on the node, on each node on the stem, where leaves appear, they appear in opposite pairs. Here's a piece of stem in between two of those nodes. You can clearly see the opposite pairs of leaves. What you could also see is that stretch of bare stem between the nodes has a more or less single file line of minute white hairs. This is a pretty nice characteristic that I am not familiar with in other plants. This picture is a picture of new shoots of our common stinging nettle. Being able to recognize this plant is useful for more than just keeping yourself from being stung, because nettle shoots are delicious and almost unbelievably nutritious. They have opposite leaf arrangement like the chickweed does, and they usually come up in colonies. This is a close-up of the back of one of the young leaves, and you see the little needles, which are actually modified plant hairs, trichomes. And this is what gives you the stinging sensation if you brush against them. The stinging hairs are held up by the internal water pressure or turgor pressure of the plant. So if you can turn off the turgor pressure of the plant, you can eat these without getting stung. And you do that by boiling, steaming, or drying. These are so nutritious that people who breed horses often use them as postnatal vitamin pills for their mares. And they do that by cutting young nettles down and drying them, because at that point they are no longer capable of irritating the inside of the horse's mouth. And you get the benefit of a fantastic list of vitamins, minerals, trace minerals that this plant is famous for acquiring. You can see here the opposite leaf arrangement. They have a pair of little tiny, minute, almost miniature leaf-looking structures called stipules at the base of the petiole where they meet the main stem. Now, if you choose to boil these to make them edible, if you boil them very long, and you don't have to boil them very long to make them edible, but if you boil them longer, the water transforms into the color black, basically. And this is an extremely nutritious vegetable soup stock that you can use to make other kinds of soup if that is your desire. A woman from France once showed me how to make boiled nettles and then put them into a blender along with a cooked potato. And then when she blended it all together, it made a delicious hot potato nettle soup that was divine. The picture on the left here shows a small stand of nettles that have recently emerged and are perfect age for harvesting for food. The plant on the far right is a male, and it has these strings of flowers that you see between the leaf nodes, each of which has a pair of anthers on it. In the middle picture, we have a picture of the female flowers, and all they appear to be are these white, fuzzy, pistillate flowers. Each fuzz is capable of landing a grain of pollen, and fertilizing the plant and therefore providing a source for seeds. Mature nettle stalks that can be up to 6 or 7 feet tall, depending on how rich their conditions are, can be processed into a fiber that for many centuries was prized even above flax, to be processed into linen. It's a little bit of a process because you have to take the dead tall nettle stalks and soak them in water to ret out the fibers. But like I said, they were even more prized than flax for centuries in Northern Europe. And that's saying something because flax has been a high demand processed linen fiber for many centuries. I think most people have some sense of what cattails look like. You cannot eat the brown, fuzzy produced seed stalk that looks like a giant corn dog on the top of a cattail stalk. Those little corn doggy looking brown things are loaded with unexpanded fuzz. And as a kid, my brother and I found that if you had a sword fight with a couple of those, you could fill a 3-bedroom ranch style home, every room to the depth of about 9 inches worth of fuzz, which would expand my mother's vocabulary for just a moment, but not in a good way. The photo of the cattails that you see here are newly emerging cattails. They would have been, this picture could have been taken a few weeks ago. These shoots of cattail can be broken off the rhizome they emerge from, and if you shed off the outer, tougher leaves, the innermost portion, which is white or pale yellow in color, is a delicious, tender, salad-appropriate vegetable object. Very delicious. Once the stalks reach a height of 2 or 3 feet at least, they are capable of emerging their flowers. This picture shows our common, what's called wide-leaf cattail, Typha latifolia, and the male flowers are the shaggy-looking beige objects at the top of that stalk. The firm, still green ones directly adjoining underneath are the female flowers. Now, when the cattail first emerges, there is a sort of leaf-like bract that covers up all the flowers. And as soon as that bract comes off, you can see, if I can find my cursor, here we go, this area here at the top that's still firm and smooth and green are the unopened male flowers. And at this age, as in this picture, you can break this or cut this off, and after a couple of minutes of boiling, you can serve them like little miniature corn on the cob. They're very popular with children because they're little tiny corn on the cob, basically, but they don't taste like corn. They have an amazing flavor that's not like anything else I know of. It's one of the truly unique wild foods that unless you get cattail immature male flowers, you'll never get to experience. Doesn't taste like chicken. Now notice also in this picture that the male flowers are sitting directly on top of the female flowers with no intervening bare stem. This tells you that you have our native Typha latifolia in front of you. This is what the flowers look like of our non-native cattail, Typha angustifolia, which means narrow-leafed cattail. Notice the male flowers are starting to open on these, and so you get a shaggy yellow appearance at the top. Flowers that have the shaggy yellow appearance are ready to deliver their pollen. The way to collect pollen is to have a bag, maybe a Ziploc plastic bag or something, bend the cattail stalk over a little bit, and by batting the male flowers around inside the bag, you will acquire a fairly high quantity of pollen. Cattail pollen is high protein and can be used as a flour substitute. But generally in cooking, you would want to mix cattail pollen with more conventional grain-based flour in order for it to behave the way that you expect flour to behave. For instance, if you're making biscuits or pancakes, you probably don't want to use just cattail flour. You probably want to add it to a pancake mix or a biscuit mix. It makes whatever you are preparing, the pancake or whatever, is a beautiful golden yellow color and higher in protein than if you just used the conventional grain mix. Now, at this age, you can also use the female flowers at the bottom. You sort of have to carve them off the stalk with a knife, but they can be used to thicken soup or stew material. They don't add, to my opinion, a ton of flavor, but they do add nutritional components that are quite desirable. So this is narrow-leafed cattail, and you can tell because it has the bare stem in between the male and female flowers. This is a picture of 10-foot tall cattails at the northwest edge of the Florida Everglades. And what we have here is the tropical species called Typha domingensis. They can be used in all the same ways as our temperate zone cattails. It's just that they're big. And of course, if you're gathering them in the Everglades, do your best to try not to feed your feet to any alligators who love to sit in these cattail colonies. Keeps them wet and sunny simultaneously if they get the right spot.
I remember about the filtering effect and possible toxicity.
This shows a picture of the rhizome of cattail. The rhizome is a starchy potential vegetable. Now, if you're interested in the rhizome, is one thing to have in the back of your mind is the fact that cattails do a really brilliant job of purifying water. And so, if you're going to use the rhizomes, especially of cattails, do your best to gather them from water that is low on pollutants. A study by the Cranbrook Institute found that cattails in Saginaw Bay were excellent at taking heavy metal pollutants out of the water. Heavy metals are not vitamins, so don't eat them. And gathering cattails from clean water is a good way to maintain your health in this way. Here is a plant that that is not an endangered species. This is called burdock. Burdock has a long reputation as an edible root vegetable. At the age you see it in the picture, where it is already flowered and is starting to make burrs, it is a little late to be gathering the root. Burdock plants their first year, grow these enormous leaves. The leaves, if you look at the underside, on the picture on the right, there's a little of the underside showing in the middle of one of the leaves. And they are fuzzy on the back. Many people see these and they think, oh, wild rhubarb. Well, besides the fact that rhubarb does not escape very much, I don't know of any part of a rhubarb plant that is fuzzy. These plants here that are just leaves that have not started to send up a stalk are essentially first-year plants. And the best time to harvest the root is at the end of the summer of their first year. Any plant that's got a tall stalk or that has flowers or is already covered with burrs is probably too late to give you the best results of its root. When you dig up the root, it can be quite large. The largest burdock roots I think I've ever dug up were roughly 4 inches in diameter at the top. Plants that are that large might be a bit tough. And if you cut through a burdock root and you slice it, and the slices have little holes in them, the holes can be lined with wood and therefore not as desirable a food product as you might have. The way we prepare burdock roots in my house is we simply scrub them down. That can be started with a high pressure hose nozzle to wash off all the dirt. These roots can be quite large. A 3-inch diameter root may be 3 feet in length. But you don't have to have mining equipment in order to harvest them. A shovel will be sufficient. We then, after they're cleaned off, they look like they have a brown skin. And then once you slice them, the interior is basically white. I like to use tender ones from small or medium-sized plants in the fall or spring. And then I saute them in a frying pan with oil and maybe some soy sauce and a pinch of salt. When my daughter was young, she basically did not consider plants to be fit for human consumption, but she developed an intense affection for the flavor of fried burdock root. Now, burdock root is an energy storing structure. And this, of course, is the sunflower family, the Asteraceae. And the most common energy storage compound in this family is a starch-like material called inulin. It is not related to insulin. Starch, produced by most of our conventional grain-type products, is a polymerized version of the sugar glucose. And so alpha amylase in your saliva breaks starch down into its glucose component. We do not have an enzyme that breaks down inulin. We do have gut bacteria who can break down inulin. Inulin is like a starch, only instead of being made of glucoses, it's made of fructose. So we do have gut bacteria who will break these down. And some of these bacteria are very important because they manage things like hunger and sugar cravings. Unfortunately, these gut bacteria flora are also methanogens, meaning they generate methane. And what that means in the diet is that if you eat a lot of burdock root, especially if you're not used to it, you will be farting a storm. I once got back from a field trip with a ton of extra burdock and fried it up and ate it myself. And I could have blown the bathroom right off the corner of the house. So if you try burdock, try it in a moderate quantity at first until you're sure that you can stay on Earth, that rocket propulsion doesn't fire you up over the back fence or something. Anyway, it's quite delicious. It is known as gobo root in several Asian cultures, and I believe the Japanese refer to it as gobo root on occasion, and I've seen it on the menu in some Asian restaurants. But like I said, it is a very desirable food product. I have in the past made burdock root and peanut butter sandwiches out of young burdock roots that were still tender. A really big burdock root, 3 inches in diameter, you could beat a mugger senseless. So I'm not sure you'd want to make a sandwich out of such a creature. But anyway, I think most of us recognize that this is one of our most common plants. The picture on the left is a plant in full flower, and the flowers vary from purple, like the middle shot, all the way to more or less pure white, like the shot on the right. You can see in the middle photograph that the involucra of the flower already has the stiff hairs with hooks on the end that give its quality of being able to stick to your pants, your socks, and your dog. They usually flower in late summer. Meanwhile, back at the Cattail Ranch, here's a picture of a stalk with the male flowers fully open. At this age, if you were in a canoe with a plastic bag, you would just bend this plant over a bit, bang it around inside the plastic bag, and collect the pollen for use as a flower supplement. Another family of plants that we are well endowed with, which make their living especially in the cool weather of late winter and early spring, is the mustard family. The mustard family have flowers that have a sort of unique and predictable formula for its parts. The formula is the flowers all have 4 petals, 4 sepals, and 6 stamens. 4 long ones in the middle, 2 short ones toward the outside. Here's one of our most common mustard weeds. This is called wintercress. Wintercress is a little bit bitter. Some people call some of these bittercress. Most people prefer them as a cooked vegetable when they're young. This is an interesting species because if perchance you keep horses, if your horses are ever used for racing, you want to make sure that they do not get into this plant, because in a horse, the horse's digestive system can transform this species of plant into a prohibited substance called what, Peter? Aminorex is the name of it. It is prohibited because it acts as a stimulant. And like I say, it's not exactly in this plant, but the horse's digestive pathways transform this plant partly into Aminorex. For us, it's an edible plant. Here it is in flower. It's a very common weed. Many of the fields of yellow that you see in the 10 days immediately after the peak of dandelion flowering are comprised by this species. Here's what the flower stalk looks like a little closer. And if you get right up to it, you can see the 4 petals, the 4 long stamens in the middle, and the 2 short ones on the outside. That formula guarantees virtually that the plant you are looking at is a mustard. Nice thing about mustards is there are very few outright poisons, toxins in the mustard family. However, mustard plants do contain a family of compounds called glucosinolates. Now, glucosinolates act as anti-cancer agents in people. However, in herbivores like goats and stuff like that, they negatively affect the thyroid. And they belong to a plant, a group of compounds called goiterogens. Here's another very common lawn mustard. This is called Cardamine hirsuta. They're often called bittercress, but in my opinion, they are delicious. When I was starting out as a scientific illustrator, I was illustrating a book on catfish anatomy at Auburn University. And I used to go for lunch across the street to a McDonald's where I could get a hamburger for something like 60 cents. And I would take my hamburger outside and graze their lawn, which was mostly this mustard. And I found it delicious. Although clearly, if you are taking something from a lawn, you really need to wash things off and make sure you're not ingesting their lawn care chemistry as well. The flowers are extremely tiny. Nobody ever made a corsage out of these flowers. They're white, always. The leaves, you can see, are pinnately compound. And in my neighborhood, they are one of the dominant weeds in late March and the first 2/3 of April.
So Peter, is this one the one that's a little bit sour?
I wouldn't describe it as sour.
No.
We have a common plant that is sour that many people mistake for clover, except that in its 3-part compound leaf, each leaflet looks like a heart attached by the tip. And they always have 5-petaled yellow flowers. And they're called oxalis.
That's the one. I had a bad habit when I was a kid of eating stuff out of the lawn or off the trees. And I think that's what I remember as being sour. That's it.
Yes, it is very sour. Some people put them in salads because their lemony sourness takes the place of salad dressing in some instances. The sourness comes from oxalic acid. Oxalic acid is the simplest of the dicarboxylic acids. In great quantity, they are a kidney toxin. One thing about oxalic acid is that it combines readily with calcium to make insoluble needle-like crystals. Calcium oxalate is the dominant compound in about 70% of human kidney stones. So if you have a personal or family history of kidney stones, my counsel to you is don't eat unlimited amounts of oxalic acid. Besides oxalis plants, we see oxalic acid in our diet, especially in strawberries, spinach, and rhubarb.
Peter, I just want to give us a 10-minute warning here.
Okay.
I don't want to shortchange you at all, but
No, it's good to give me a 10-minute warning. Otherwise, I will talk until you fall to your knees and beg for mercy.
I want to make sure we have a little time for Q&A too. So how about 5 more minutes and then,
Sure, okay, tell me when those 5 come up, because I don't sit in front of my time very much.
okay.
Okay, here we have another common mustard. This is Thlaspi arvensis, also called pennycress. Can be used, as you see it here, as a boiled vegetable, but they very quickly turn into stalks with circular seed pods. There are some that have a little notch at the distant end. I counsel you, if you're the kind of person who takes wild mustard seeds in order to make a homemade condiment mustard, my counsel is not to use the reddish purple seeds of pennycress, because they have a compound in them that in abundance can damage stomach linings. This plant is common in places that are always wet. And I don't mean just moist, but I mean like the edge of a stream or a vernal pond that does not dry up in the early summer. This is called watercress. I grew up as a kid on the edge of an immense watercress patch. And one of the things I found curious was it has a kind of mustardy hotness. And the heat, if you will, of the mustard compounds was the opposite of the seasons. It was hottest in the winter and most mild in the summer. But it's a delicious flavor. And if you have enjoyed watercress available commercially, that same plant can be found in our area in the wild in stream edges and wet spots. I don't know how apparent it is in the top photograph, but it has pinnately lobed leaves. And of course, you see the white flowers in the photo underneath with the characteristic mustard signature of 4 petals and 6 stamens, although I'd be hard pressed to count the stamens in this picture. And that's one of the problems with the mustard family. This formula, which is so useful, it can often be a little hard to determine when the flowers are infinitesimal. And many mustards have flowers smaller than 1/8 of an inch in diameter, which makes counting stamens challenging. So sometimes it helps to have a hand lens with you to help you discern some of the details. This is a sheet of illustrations I did that show the basic shapes of mustard leaves. Not every genus in our area is depicted here, but it gives you an idea that learning some of the leaf shapes can help you in some cases. Garden and disturbed ground weeds are one of the large sources of edible wild plants. I have here a picture of a colony of weeds, one of our most common weeds of gardens or any kind. A garden, because you dig it up and smooth it out, qualifies as a disturbed ground habitat. And this plant, which is common lamb's quarters, almost always comes up if you have disturbed ground in Michigan, or indeed most of the United States have this as a practically ubiquitous weed contribution. Generally, I recommend that if you have a garden and 1,000,000 weeds come up, about 60% of those weeds usually are comprised of edible plants.
Sure, that's your time's up.
Okay, this plant here is in the genus Chenopodium, and this genus has been used as human food for many millennia.
Okay.
So I think I used up my minutes.
Hate to cut you off when you got to my favorite.
Yeah.
I
it
love
is-
lamb's quarters.
Yes, it is wonderful. It's actually in the Amaranthaceae family, which is the same family as spinach. And it has excellent flavor as a boiled vegetable.
Well, hopefully we can continue this. I'm happy if folks, we want to make it through after the hour, but does anyone have any questions or comments they want to make before we complete our first hour?
Thank
I
you
guess-
all for coming and thank you for your kind attention.
Well, if there's no questions, if you want to continue for another 4 minutes,
Okay,
Well,
charging.
Laura, I have a question. In terms of,
please.
you're saying you like white lambs, do you like to eat it or do you like to have it around? Like, what do you mean that you like, it's one of your favorites?
it's
Well,
almost
I
like
mean,
a,
in
oh,
this
go ahead.
picture here, you see a bunch of young seedlings. And you can eat the tender part at the top, whatever the top half of the stem is. And that use continues almost all summer because as it's growing into a big bushy plant, there's always tender new branches and shoots
Okay.
as a boiled vegetable. Delicious.
I've made spinach pizza with it and it's almost crunchy.
Okay. Thank you.
I mean, not in a bad way, but just it tastes nutritious and delicious.
This is
Steamed.
what the leaves look like up close. That white texture you saw in the center of the new crowns in the last picture, that white part is actually made of this. And these little white, or in some cases purple structures, give it a sort of mealy look to the top of the leaf. Here's what those little things look like under high magnification. There's actually a species called giant lamb's quarters, Chenopodium giganteum, that are characterized by, instead of looking white in their new shoots, they look purple. And this is why.
I guess I do want to mention before people totally sign off that next week, Bill Stow is going to be here. He publishes a monthly newsletter called Optimistic News for a Functional Biosphere. He's also a fairly renowned sustainability consultant, so I hope you'll join us with him next Wednesday. Peter, thank you for revealing your illustrious background, your the pictures that you've drawn. I didn't know that about you, that you were an illustrator as well.
Yes, the first summer that I decided I would make my living entirely from my drawings, I was so successful that I literally had to learn edible plants or starve. So that was the beginning of a long relationship with many of these plants.
Anybody else have any parting comments or questions, or should we just keep going here for a while?
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. It's phenomenal.
Thank
Your
you so
brain
much.
is your brain is amazing.
Well, thank you very much.
That's great.
And should we continue this another time then?
Yeah, whenever you like. Yeah.
How many more slides would you estimate you have to complete for this
Well,
presentation?
I have to figure out a way to look at the overview panel on the left, which I've lost here for the moment.
We can talk about it maybe another time, but thank you so
Sure.
much for joining us, and it's been good. I'll look
Lots
forward.
of edible plants in our area, so there's a lot more species that could come up for discussion.
Maybe we could have an outing in your backyard sometime.
Oh, that would be great. Or somewhere,
Potluck.
even more diverse.
Sounds good, Peter. Thanks,
Yes.
everybody. I'll look forward to seeing you next week, if not sooner.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.